Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and this week we're going to be discussing Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré, the famous spy novel from 1974. One of the best spy novels ever written, and today we're going to talk about why that is and what makes this a literary work. And one of the things on this podcast is I'm primarily interested in not just analyzing any old book, but analyzing works of literature, works that I think are truly great works of literature that deserve a place in the canon of English literature. You might remember from our very first episode on Brideshead Revisited, as I said, one of my goals here is to try and preserve what I think are important pieces of cultural heritage at a time when I feel like fewer and fewer people are reading books. Now, this book, obviously, lots of people have read. This book is, I think, not necessarily one that's in danger of losing relevance or losing interest. But what I think is important here is, I've read a lot of spy novels, contemporary spy novels, that claim to be inspired by John le Carré, that try and claim a kind of lineage from John le Carré. At least the blurbs claim that. But when you read many of these spy novels, they're not exactly John le Carré. They're missing something essential. And what I think they're missing, what a lot of contemporary spy novels fail to do that John le Carré does very well, they're missing the cynicism of this book. They're missing the cynicism of John le Carré. Because the truth is, John le Carré does not believe spies are heroes, at least in the context of this book. It is a very anti-heroic vision of intelligence agencies. And the problem with so many contemporary thrillers and contemporary spy novels is they can't help but see their characters as heroes. They can't help but see their characters as morally just agents in a world that, by the end of the novel, will be turned right side up again. And that's the flaw of so many contemporary spy novels, and that's what makes Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy so fascinating and so important as a novel. It really captures the pessimism of the 1970s, especially a very English post-war pessimism, a pessimism around the idea of the declining British Empire. Not even just declining, but declined already. That's the conclusion you reach when you get to the end of this novel. There is nothing optimistic in this novel in the way it presents espionage, in the way it presents the British Empire. And those other spy novels that get published these days, they still have a positive vision of the function of a spy, of a function of an intelligence service. They still believe in the idea of empire, especially the American thrillers and the American spy novels. They are, at their heart, fundamentally conservative. John le Carré is fundamentally not conservative in his vision. At least, when I say conservative, what I mean is he doesn't believe there is anything of value in the British Empire or in preserving the order that the British Empire represented. Perhaps he's melancholy to some extent, melancholy and nostalgic about the declined British Empire, about the end of the empire. We're going to talk about some passages where we see a little bit of that nostalgia, but he's wise enough to recognize that empire is not coming back. And so, again, very rarely read a contemporary spy novel that has the same worldview as John le Carré, and that's what makes him the undisputed master of this genre. He recognizes where in history he is. And that's something that a lot of contemporary thrillers, contemporary spy novels fail to do. They're more like James Bond, a kind of anachronistic, historyless espionage thriller, in which the spy is always the same, no matter what time period he lives in. The British Empire is always the same, and in the end, the moral order of the universe is always the same. Whereas in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the whole point is that the moral order of the universe has been overturned. And what we have is a beautiful, really sad novel about what it's like to live in the ruins of what was once a great empire. That's what this novel is about. And we're going to look at that and sort of see that come up in different contexts. The other thing, obviously, I want to say is that, this is a novel that's been turned into a movie most recently in 2011, starring Gary Oldman. And if you go back further, it was turned into a TV show starring Alec Guinness as George Smiley. These adaptations are good, of course. I really enjoyed the 2011 movie, but I'm not here to talk about adaptations. I'm here to talk about the novel. A novel can do things that television shows and movies can't do, that a visual medium like film cannot do. And on this podcast, we're interested in novels. We're interested in language. We're interested in looking at the things that novels can do. And so some of you may be familiar with the movie version of this book, but I do want to emphasize that the movie is not the same as the book. Seeing the movie is no substitute for reading the novel. I'm not saying the movie is imperfect or not good. I very much enjoyed the movie, and I actually think it's a very good adaptation of a very complex and very slow novel. But the experience of reading this novel is something else entirely. You get into Smiley's head, obviously, but you also get into the heads of these minor characters who have an important role in John le Carré's vision for this declining British Empire. Character of Jim Prideaux and the character of Peter Gwilym. So Peter Gwilym is sort of like the protege of Smiley. Another spy who is, I think he's closer in age to John le Carré when he wrote this. He's supposed to be 40 in the novel, and he's still meant to be a young spy compared to Smiley. And the other character who we get a lot of point of view chapters from is Jim Prideaux, the field agent, who's an integral part of the plot of this novel. There are other minor characters whose points of view we inhabit briefly at different times in the novel. But the larger point is, the novel provides insights, the novel provides a way of experiencing the story. It's fundamentally different from the film. And we're going to look at some passages of interiority especially from Smiley, of course, that really get at the bigger theme that John le Carré is conveying here through this story. Now, the structure of the story is pretty straightforward. It's kind of a classic mystery, right? Early on in the novel, Smiley learns that there is a mole in what is referred to as the circus, which is John le Carré's word for MI6, essentially, the British Intelligence Service. And the novel basically follows Smiley as he seeks to uncover this mole. Now, what's important here is, tonally, the novel is nothing like what we think of when we think of the phrase spy novel or spy thriller. There are no car chases, there are no shootouts, there's not even really any action. The entire novel is essentially just a series of conversations and moments where Smiley, our protagonist, thinks about things. And that's it. And that's what I think is so brilliant about this novel. John le Carré is such a good writer that he manages to make a series of conversations between Smiley and various people in a series of rooms profoundly compelling. And part of this is that le Carré is very good at developing supporting characters and minor characters who have very clear and strong personalities. And so each time Smiley meets a new person, to talk to them, to ask them questions, to learn things about this potential mole, the person he's talking to is very idiosyncratic, very specific, very interesting as a supporting character. And they often have, as we're going to see, some key thematic links. They function very well in the novel as part of the thematic commentary. Something I always say to my creative writing students, when you're crafting a novel, your supporting characters should ideally be in some way thematically connected. Not all of them, but many of them will be in some way thematically connected. We're going to look at moments from different supporting characters to see how they connect thematically to the larger ideas that le Carré is trying to convey through this novel about the decline of the British Empire, about pessimism and cynicism. I want to start, though, let's start in the first chapter. So the first chapter does not actually start with Smiley. The first chapter actually begins with Jim Prideaux, with the field operative who's going to be a major part of this novel. And it actually begins at an English boarding school, kind of a school in which Jim Prideaux is hired to be a teacher. Tonally, it's very calm, peaceful, quiet. But let's think about why le Carré chooses to start this way. Why start in an English boarding school? Why start with something that seems so unlike what we expect when we think of a Cold War spy novel? Well, remember, this is a novel about England. It's a novel about the decline of England. It's a novel about the decline of a certain kind of England, the glorious England of the Empire prior to and during World War II. It's about the decline of that type of empire. And the boarding school sort of, you could say, represents a setting that in some romantic contexts is connected to that old empire. I think he chooses the setting of a boarding school because it gives us this sense of tradition. It gives us this sense of a classic image of Britain, a classic image of England. And yet, as we're going to see, one of the big points that Le Carré is making is that England is no longer the same, that England is corrupt now, that in the Cold War, all of that is gone. So I think the setting is important just for that reason. And we're introduced to Jim Prideaux, and we can tell, right, that he has some type of background. Though as of now, as of the first chapter, we don't yet know exactly who he is, but we get a sense that there's more to his background than is first apparent. Let's look in particular at a passage where he's teaching his students, and he starts talking about England. In this context, the different kids are trying to find a nickname for Jim. So a lot of this chapter is narrated from the perspective of Bill Roach, one of the boys at the school, and also kind of collectively from the boys' perspective here. They're looking at Jim, they're fascinated by him, by this new teacher, with this fascinating aura surrounding him, and they're trying to give him a nickname. So let's read this passage. It's where they think about the nickname goulash, partly because of what he likes to eat. So let's start with this paragraph that says, "Yet goulash did not satisfy them. Yet goulash did not satisfy them either. It lacked the hint of strength contained. It took no account of Jim's passionate Englishness, which was the only subject where he could be relied on to waste time. Toad Spikely had only to venture one disparaging comment on the monarchy, extol the joys of some foreign country, preferably a hot one, for Jim to color sharply and snap out a good 3 minutes' worth on the privilege of being born an Englishman. He knew they were teasing him, but he was unable not to rise. Often he ended his homily with a rueful grin, and muttered references to red herrings, and red faces too, when certain people would have to come in for extra work and miss their football. But England was his love. When it came down to it, no one suffered for her. Best place in the whole damn world, he bellowed once. Know why? Know why, Toad? Spikely did not. So Jim seized a crayon and drew a globe. To the west, America, he said, full of greedy fools fouling up their inheritance. To the east, China, Russia. He drew no distinction. Boiler suits, prison camps, and a damn long march to nowhere. In the middle. So let's think about that passage, because that introduces us to the theme of Englishness, the theme of England, right? Jim Prideaux loves England, as is stated very clearly. And the way he describes his love for England, right, is he says it's in the middle, right, between America on one side and China, Russia on the other. It's kind of interesting, right? In the context of the Cold War, he's essentially saying England sits in the middle. That even though it's obviously on America's side in the Cold War, on the side of the West, it is still distinct and different from America. It doesn't have, what does he call it? It doesn't have America's greedy fools fouling up their inheritance. And it doesn't have, on the China-Russia side, boiler suits, prison camps, and a damn long march to nowhere. That's his ideal of England. That it is this perfect middle between those two sides. And he says, best place in the whole damn world. Now, rereading this passage, having experienced the whole novel, I think what's fascinating here is when you look back at it, the truth is, Jim is wrong. That's the conclusion that the novel reaches at the end. And that's kind of Jim's own character arc, is that after he speaks to Smiley by the end of the novel and kind of realizes, essentially, that his old friend Bill Hayden is the mole, not just his old friend, but implicitly his old lover. That's the subtle implication of their former friendship. He realizes that he's wrong. And that when you look back at these phrases, England is also full of greedy fools fouling up their inheritance. I mean, that's essentially all the different people in the circus whom Smiley suspects of being the spy. Alaline, Bland, Esterhaz, and of course Hayden, who has maybe the biggest inheritance because he is associated with a certain suave, debonair, old-fashioned England, and he has really corrupted that inheritance. He has really fouled it up. And then same thing with the China-Russia side. Boiler suits, prison camps, and a damn long march to nowhere. In a way, that's also a description of England at this point in its history. As we see at the end of the novel, England is also on a damn long march to nowhere. And so what I love about this passage is that it begins by positioning England as separate, different, unique. And by the end, both Jim and, of course, Smiley, our protagonist, realize that England is no longer those things. That's kind of the real cynicism of this novel, and the reason I think no novel that attempts to do what Le Carré is doing has done it successfully, is that deep down in this novel, what we learn at the end is that the mole was correct in his assessment. When he decides to side with the Soviet Union over England and calls it an aesthetic choice, the book is essentially suggesting that he's not wrong, that England no longer has the glory, the glamour that it once had. It is no longer this idyllic vision that Jim sketches out for us at the beginning. That's the big theme of this novel. And as I always say in my creative writing classes, the theme is best understood as a conflict between two sets of values. And you have to introduce those sets of values early on in your novel. So what are the two sets of values? I mean, essentially the two sets of values are, is England this thing that Jim thinks it is? Is England really unique and beautiful and separate? Or to use his words, is it really the best place in the whole damn world? Or is it like everywhere else? That's the thematic conflict of this novel. That's what's set up in the very first chapter with this discussion by Jim. So moving on from here, I want to look at a few other sections in the beginning. In chapter 2, right, this is when we're introduced to Smiley, and Smiley has a conversation with one of his colleagues, and this is when we start to learn about the new people who have taken over the circus, who have taken over the intelligence service. Smiley, we learn, has been pushed out because he believed there was a mole, and eventually he got pushed out. And he was replaced by a group of people. Chief among them is a man named Percy Alaline. So Percy Alaline is a wonderful supporting character in this novel. We don't meet him too much in person, but he's referenced a lot. And from Smiley's perspective and from a lot of the characters' perspectives, he represents the diluted version of leadership, the kind of self-serving leaders who now rule England. The idea is that Alaline is nothing like the previous generation of leaders, that he is ambitious, wants things for himself, and is not really interested in the country as a whole. And by the end, he is not the spy. He is one of the suspects, but he is not the spy. He's the tinker, right, in the title, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He turns out not to have been the spy, but he is what is sometimes called a useful idiot. He is the one who is manipulated successfully by the spy and by the Russian agent Carla, who is running the spy. But let's look at this description of Alaline in chapter 2. This is right towards the end of the chapter, where the person Smiley is talking to, a man named Martindale, is kind of reflecting on Percy, and he says, "Somehow I can never quite believe in Percy Alaline as chief, can you? Is it age, George, or is it just my natural cynicism? Do tell me, you're so good at people. I suppose power sits poorly on those we've grown up with. Is that a clue? There are so few who can carry it off for me these days. And poor Percy's such an obvious person, I always think, especially after that little serpent, Control." So Control is the sort of enigmatic title/name given to the predecessor of Percy, the previous chief, who suspected, rightly, that there was a mole in the circus. And Control sort of represents, Control is dead at the beginning of the novel. He represents the previous generation of leaders who are now replaced by a worse version, a diluted and diminished version. At the same time, Control himself is also not an ideal character. He, in the novel, by the end of his life, as he becomes obsessed with the idea of the mole, and is sort of depicted as like feverishly obsessed in a way where he makes mistakes and essentially drives himself to his death, to his early death. Another contrast to Smiley, who is much calmer and more methodical in his methods. Continuing on, though. That's heavy good fellowship. How can one take him seriously? One has only to think of him in the old days. They're talking here about Percy. One has only to think of him in the old days, lolling in the bar of the travellers, sucking away on that log pipe of his, and buying drinks for the moguls. Well, really, one does like one's perfidy to be subtle, don't you agree? Or don't you care as long as it's successful? What's his knack, George? What's his secret recipe? He was speaking most intently, leaning forward, his eyes greedy and excited. Only food could otherwise move him so deeply. Living off the wits of his subordinates, well, maybe that's leadership these days. So that's a key line, because later we learn that one of his subordinates, Bill Hayden, was the secret spy who was essentially feeding him this false information. So that passage is a nice passage that really sums up in a very critical way the new leadership of the intelligence service. The new leadership as embodied by this character, Percy Allaline. And what's emphasized about him? So our speaker here, Roddy Martindale, who's just a minor character, he says, one has only to think of him in the old days, lolling in the bar of the travellers, sucking away on that log pipe of his and buying drinks for the moguls. So he tries to imagine what would Percy have been like in the old days, essentially meaning the early 20th century, the days where the British Empire was at its height. And he says Percy would be the kind of guy who would be in the bar buying drinks for people. And that's how, according to Martindale, that's how Percy succeeds, right? When he asks George, what's his knack? What's his secret recipe? And then he answers that question himself. He says, living off the wits of his subordinates. The idea is Percy is good at manipulating people. Percy is good at being chummy, right? Buying drinks for people. But he's not a good leader, is the idea. The idea is that these days, that's all you need to be a leader. You need to put it in our modern parlance, you need to network, right? You need to know people, and you need to be ambitious. But you don't, it's implied, need to be actually good at your job. You don't actually need to be intelligent. And Percy, throughout this, is depicted as ambitious, chummy, but not very wise, not very smart, and ultimately easily manipulated, right? The useful idiot, to use the phrase I used earlier. So already by chapter 2, we've got a second passage, right? A second description of the decline of England, the diminishment of the leadership of the intelligence service. There's a line later in the novel where one of the characters, I believe it's Smiley, says, a country's health can be measured by the strength of its intelligence service. And that's what we see here. Essentially, it's suggesting that because the new head of the intelligence service, the new chief, is an ambitious but empty man, England itself has become that too. England itself has lost something as a country and as an empire. All right, now moving on, the first kind of third of this novel then is taken up by Ricky Tarr, by the story of Ricky Tarr. This is what in traditional story structure we would call the inciting incident. Essentially, the idea is, Ricky Tarr is this character who comes to Smiley with new evidence that there might be a mole. And then Smiley is basically authorized by one of the lower cabinet officials, one of the undersecretaries, Oliver Lacon, who is not in the Secret Service, is a civil servant, but who is part of the oversight. So once they discover that there could be a mole in the circus, based on Ricky Tarr's evidence, based on the story that he tells, that's sort of the inciting incident that kicks things off, that gets Smiley to decide to investigate. Now, Ricky Tarr's story, though, and Ricky Tarr himself, I think he's a really important character, even though he really only appears in this one long scene at the beginning, which takes up several chapters, and then in a scene towards the middle, and then in one last scene towards the end. So even though he only appears a few times in the novel, his character is one of the few characters to really feel passionate emotion in this novel. Specifically, he falls in love with a woman named Irina, who is essentially also a Russian spy, while they're in Hong Kong. And she's the one who reveals to him that there is a Soviet mole in the circus, right, in the British intelligence service. But Ricky Tarr's emotional connection to Irina is really the only earnest emotional storyline in this novel. Because the other, I guess you could call it a love story, is Smiley's, of course, but that's a much darker and sadder story. Smiley's, of course, in love with his wife, Anne, but his wife, Anne, is unfaithful to him, regularly and repeatedly unfaithful to him. And Anne doesn't really love him, even though Smiley clearly loves her. And as we discover, of course, by the end, the man who is sleeping with Anne, Bill Hayden, happens to be the spy, right? Ends up being the spy. And that's obviously no coincidence. That's part of Le Carré's intelligent structure to this novel. And we'll talk about the ending, and we'll talk about the really bleak ending to Smiley and Anne's story. But Ricky Tarr, by contrast, his love for Irina feels a lot more pure, feels a lot more earnest. Let's look first at Ricky Tarr's introduction. Because again, when we think about these supporting characters in Le Carré's novel, the supporting characters all have clear thematic connections. They're clearly meant to represent some aspect of Le Carré's theme. And Ricky Tarr, as we're going to see, he really represents, I believe, the colonial sins of the British Empire. That's who Ricky Tarr represents, and through his love with Irina, that's Tarr's attempt to atone almost for the things he's done. Let's look at the introduction to Ricky Tarr, which will kind of reinforce my idea of what he's supposed to represent in this novel. So this is in chapter 4, towards the end. Tarr's father was an Australian solicitor, living in Penang, it seemed. The mother was a small-time actress from Bradford, who came east with a British drama group before the war. The father, Smiley recalled, had an evangelical streak and preached in local gospel halls. The mother had a small criminal record in England, but Tarr's father either didn't know or didn't care. When the war came, the couple evacuated to Singapore for the sake of their young son. A few months later, Singapore fell, and Ricky Tarr began his education in Changi jail under Japanese supervision. In Changi, the father preached God's charity to everyone in sight, and if the Japs hadn't persecuted him, his fellow prisoners would have done the job for them. With liberation, the three of them went back to Penang. Ricky tried to read for the law, but more often broke it, and the father turned some rough preachers loose on him to beat the sin out of his soul. Tarr flew the coop to Borneo. At 18, he was a fully paid-up gunrunner, playing all 7 ends against the middle around the Indonesian islands, and that was how McLivor stumbled on him. By the time he had graduated from the nursery, the Malayan emergency had broken. Tarr was played back into gunrunning. Almost the first people he bumped into were his old Belgian friends. They were too busy supplying guns to the communists to bother where he had been, and they were short-handed. Tarr ran a few shipments for them in order to blow their contacts. Then one night got them drunk, shot 4 of them, including Rose, and set fire to their boat. He hung around Malaya and did a couple more jobs before being called back to Brixton and refitted for special operations in Kenya. Or, in less sophisticated language, hunting Mau Mau for bounty. After Kenya, Smiley pretty much lost sight of him, but a couple of incidents stuck in his memory because they might have become scandals, and Control had to be informed. In 1964, Tarr was sent to Brazil to make a crash offer of a bribe to an armaments minister known to be in deep water. Tarr was too rough. The minister panicked and told the press. Tarr had Dutch cover, and no one was wiser except Netherlands intelligence, who were furious. In Spain, a year later, acting on a tip-off supplied by Bill Hayden, Tarr blackmailed, or burned, as the scalp hunters would say, a Polish diplomat who had lost his heart to a dancer. The first yield was good. Tarr won a commendation and a bonus. But when he went back for a second helping, the Pole wrote a confession to his ambassador and threw himself, with or without encouragement, from a high window. So, in a few paragraphs, that's quite a summary of his life, right? But what do we learn about him, right? First of all, it's important that he is born in the colonies, lives in the colonies. He is a character associated with the British colonies and all the sort of violence and suppression associated with the colonies. When he's first introduced earlier in the chapter, it's emphasized that he had a colonial accent, and he's introduced himself as Tar, sir, Ricky Tar from Penang. So he is, from the beginning, associated with the British colonies. Penang, by the way, is a place in Malaysia. And in that passage we just read, look at all the things he's associated with. Look at all the violence he's associated with. Right? First, he turns on these Belgian colleagues who he used to run guns with. The woman Rose was referenced earlier in the chapter. It was emphasized that she was one of his former lovers, right, when he was young. And he ends up killing her for the British. When he discovers that these Belgians are supplying guns to the communists, he kills her, and he kills his former companions. What else does he do? There's a little reference to Kenya, hunting Mau Mau for bounty. The Mau Mau are a group of Kenyan rebels in the 1950s. This is a pretty dark chapter of the British Empire that's not often talked about, where the British essentially put down the Mau Mau uprising with pretty brutal tactics. Pretty brutal and pretty dark tactics. So it's not referenced exactly what he does, but if you read between the lines, it's implied that he's committed a lot of sins for the British Empire. And then, of course, there's this final section about the Polish diplomat who ends up killing himself because Tar blackmails him. And so all of these together point to a character who is associated with the sins of the British Empire. And I'm using the word sins there very clearly because in that same passage, remember, it says Tar's father had an evangelical streak and preached in local gospel halls and would basically try and beat the sin out of Tar. So Tar's relationship to his father is strained by a kind of moral compunction, so to speak, by this question of sin. And what seems to happen? Tar runs away and essentially gets adopted by the British Secret Service. In other words, he replaces his real evangelical father with the British Empire. And the British Empire doesn't care about sin. The British Empire is not going to try and beat the sin out of Tar. They're going to let him do what they want. So I think John le Carré wisely sets up Ricky Tar with this inner conflict around sin. Because when he meets Irina, and when we see his relationship with Irina in the flashback that as he recounts, we see that Irina to Ricky Tar represents the chance at salvation. That's how Irina is presented. And that's how his love for Irina is presented. Even though she's obviously already with someone, their love is presented as pure and a chance for him to redeem himself. Let's look at why that is. Let's look at moments where we see that idea of redemption. So let's look at chapter 8 first. So this is when he finds a journal in which Irina writes to him about the mole and basically tells him about the mole. At this point, though, it's possibly already too late. Irina already might have been captured and whisked off back to Russia. And so Tar is reading this diary of hers with the knowledge, obviously, that she might already be dead, that she might already have been taken back to Russia. At the very end of this chapter, at the very end of chapter 8, we get this wonderful passage where after she's essentially told Tar about the mole, she says, "In my heart I am free. You have seen only the bad things in me, the drink, the fear, the lies we live. But deep inside me burns a new and blessed light. I used to think that the secret world was a separate place, and that I was banished forever to an island of half people. But Thomas," that's Tar's code name, that's the name she thinks is his, that's who she thinks he is. "But Thomas, it is not separate. God has shown me that it is here, right in the middle of the real world, all round us, and we have only to open the door and step outside to be free. Thomas, you must always long for the light which I have found. It is called love. Now I shall take this to our secret place and leave it there while there is still time. Dear God, I hope there is. God, give me sanctuary in his church. Remember it. I loved you there also. So, that's quite I would say, in a novel that's quite dark and cynical and despairing about hope and the future and possibility, that's the most earnest and intense passage that we have. She is religious, right? She is speaking about God, which directly connects to, obviously, Tar's father, the evangelical preacher. And what is she saying? She's essentially telling Tar that just because they're spies, right? Because the idea is Irina is also a spy for the Russians. She also lives in the secret world. That just because they are spies does not mean they are incapable of experiencing salvation, right? She says the secret world is not a separate place, is not an island of half people. It is the real world. And all you have to do is open the door and step outside to be free. And essentially that's what she's done. She says she's done that. She's found love. And of course, the true tragedy of this, of course, is that she's probably dead by this point. And Tar seems to hold out hope that she might still be alive, but Smiley obviously knows, and later they have confirmed that she was killed back in Russia, for betraying them. So it's quite devastating, but at the same time, Irina experiences a kind of moral freedom, a moral purity at the end here. A moral redemption at the end here. And the idea is, can Tar experience this redemption? Can Smiley experience this redemption? Can England experience this redemption? By the end of the novel, I think the answer is no, that they're all beyond redemption, that England is beyond redemption. But here, early on, the possibility is brought up that maybe you can leave the secret world. The secret world is, of course, the world of spies, the world that all these characters inhabit, the morally gray world. Maybe you can leave this world, open the door, and step outside into the light. And in a way, secretly, that's going to be the buried hope of Smiley and of all these characters, that if they can just discover who this mole is, they might be able to achieve this kind of redemption. But as we're going to see when we get to the end of the novel, Le Carré's point is that they won't, and they can't, and it's too late. But the idea is presented here early, dangled as a kind of possibility. And then look at the last few lines, one more set of lines here. Tar was extremely pale, and his hands, as he pulled open his shirt to return the diary to its purse, were trembling and moist. There's a last bit, he said. It goes, Thomas, why could you remember so few prayers from your boyhood? Your father was a great and good man. Like I told you, he explained. She was crazy. And it's just a wonderful ending to that section because obviously he's deeply affected by what he's just read, right? What is the phrase? He's extremely pale. His hands were trembling and moist. He's clearly affected by what she says. And he ends the phrase by saying she was crazy. He downplays it, but of course, we know as readers she was not crazy. Out of all these characters, she's the most sane. She's the one who sees it for what it is. She's the one who sees the possibility of redemption. And the final end to this chapter, which I think is really beautiful, Lacon had opened the blinds now, and the full white light of day was pouring into the room. The windows looked onto a small paddock where Jackie Lacon, a fat little girl in plaits and a riding hat, was cautiously cantering her pony. So, right, they're at Lacon's house, right? Lacon is the undersecretary, the minister, basically the civil service operative who's overseeing the hunt for this mole. And the chapter ends with this image of Lacon's little daughter, right? The idea of, it's an idea of innocence, of the future, but also it's this question. What is the country that this girl is going to inherit is the question that this chapter is implicitly asking. Is it a country capable of redemption, as Irina is saying, or is it a country that is beyond redemption? That's kind of the unspoken question that Le Carré leaves us with. Again, it's a masterpiece of subtext. And this is why he is such a wonderful writer. This is why he's such a brilliant writer. This is why he deserves to be in the literary canon, is he's a master of scenes and of subtext. There is so much that is unsaid and unspoken in this novel, but that we can parse out when we read between the lines. So The next part of the novel is basically taken up by Smiley meeting different people, talking to different people, investigating and exploring this question, who is the spy? And each time he meets different people, we get this theme of England's decline reinforced. One example of this, let's look at chapter 11. So in this chapter, right, chapter 11, this is when Peter Gwilym, essentially Smiley's protege, is in the circus looking for files, and he runs into Bill Hayden. Now this is important, obviously, because Bill ends up being the spy, right? Bill is the one who is sleeping with Smiley's wife and is eventually going to be revealed as the spy. Let's look at this description of Bill through Gwilym's perspective. And the emphasis here is that Gwilym really likes Bill. Bill represents an old-fashioned kind of spy who Gwilym really respects. So reading here from the middle of the paragraph, kind of in the middle of the chapter. Outdoors he was swift and eager. This is describing Bill. His keen face, in this clammy corridor, shadowed and withdrawn, seemed in the free air to be fashioned by the outlandish places where he had served. There was no end to them, no operational theater, in Gwilym's admiring eyes, that did not bear the Hayden imprint somewhere. Over and again in his own career, he had made the same eerie encounter with Bill's exotic progress. A year or two back, still working on marine intelligence and having as one of his targets the assembly of a team of coast watchers for the Chinese ports of Wenchao and Amoy, Gwilym discovered, to his amazement, that there were actually Chinese stay-behind agents living in those very towns, recruited by Bill Hayden in the course of some forgotten wartime exploit, rigged out with cached radios and equipment, with whom contact might be made. Another time, raking through war records of circus strong-arm men, more out of nostalgia for the period than present professional optimism, Gwilym stumbled twice on Hayden's work name in as many minutes. In 1941, he was running French fishing smacks out of the Helford estuary. In the same year, with Jim Prideaux as his stringer, he was laying down courier lines across southern Europe, from the Balkans to Madrid. To Gwilym, Hayden was of that unrepeatable, fading circus generation, to which his parents and George Smiley also belonged. Exclusive, and in Hayden's case blue-blooded, which had lived a dozen leisured lives to his own hasty one, and still, 30 years later, gave the circus its dying flavor of adventure. So the emphasis there is that Bill Hayden is adventurous. That phrase, the dying flavor of adventure, is perfectly encapsulates the theme of the novel. The idea is Bill Hayden has all of these wartime exploits. The idea is that, he served in the war. He's of that generation that served in the war. And therefore he has, as Gwilym says, he's part of an unrepeatable, fading circus generation who had lived a dozen leisured lives to his own hasty one. Peter is supposed to be around 40 in this novel, which means that during the war, right, he would have been a child. He would not have served in the war like people of this older generation, like people of his parents' generation. And so the idea is that they seem to have lived so many lives, so many exciting and exotic lives. The phrase that's used earlier, Bill's exotic progress. It's emphasized that he created these stay-behind agents in China, that he was running French fishing smacks out of the Helford estuary, and that he was laying down courier lines across southern Europe from the Balkans to Madrid. It seems like he's everywhere. He's all over Europe. He's all over the world doing things for the British Empire. That's important because ultimately, when he turns out to have been the spy, it's the ultimate betrayal, right? It's one of the greatest spies from the wartime era. And 30 years later, it turns out he was a spy the whole time. It totally devalues the mystique of these old spies. It totally devalues, in many ways, the British victory in World War II. It suggests that actually this romantic glamour, this romanticism in the way that Gwilym looks back at men like Bill Hayden, is false, and that actually he was a spy. And we're going to look at a scene later, Gwilym's reaction to finally learning that Bill is a spy, and the profound pessimism and cynicism that he feels when he discovers this. You know, many people have said that Bill Hayden is loosely based on Kim Philby, who's the famous spy. That might be true, and certainly John le Carré would have been in those circles and in that world. You know, Kim Philby's a fascinating figure. If you want to read about him, there's a lot to read about him. I think he's a really interesting historical figure, really representative. And perhaps it's true, right, that this character of Bill Hayden is loosely based on Philby. But whenever I read a novel, I try to avoid those biographical connections, as we've seen. And so I want to emphasize here that I'm not really looking for connections to real world double agents like Philby. I think Bill Hayden is interesting enough as a character in this novel. We don't really need to analyze his connections to the real world. Le Carré does such a good job of creating this self-contained character in this novel, and what the text gives us is more than enough to create a fascinating figure here. So there are a lot of other passages we could look at in the middle of the novel. We're not going to look at all of them. A few of the key moments, though, that I think are important. You know, in chapter 13, Smiley meets Connie Sachs. She's another person from Smiley generation who worked at the circus and has been fired, let go, for meddling too much into this question of a potential spy. That chapter has a lot towards the end about Connie reflecting on the end of empire, right? On the end of the British Empire. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we can just look at the end of chapter 13. You know, Connie is drunk, and she's lamenting the way things have changed. It was a good time, do you hear? A real time. Englishmen could be proud then. Let them be proud now. And then she says, poor loves, trained to empire, trained to rule the waves, all gone, all taken away. Bye-bye, world. You're the last, George. You and Bill, and filthy Percy a bit. Right, so the idea is she's quite literally, I mean, this is pretty direct here, she's lamenting the end of the empire, and she's suggesting that these people, Bill, Smiley, Percy, they were born to rule an empire, but what have they inherited? Right? Whatever they've inherited is not the empire they were trained to rule. It is something else. The other, of course, big moment in the middle of the novel is when Smiley tells the story of meeting Carla to Gwillem. This is kind of a key flashback right in the middle of the novel. And we're not going to read this whole flashback. This is when we sort of learned that Smiley talked too much to Carla about his wife, about Anne. And later we understand that this was the moment that the master spy Carla realized that this was Smiley's weakness, right? His love for his wife. That was something that he and Bill could exploit. But the key line in this middle section, and what I think is kind of one of the key thematic declarations, is that Smiley says to Carla, there is as little worth on your side as there is on mine. So let's just read. This is in chapter 23. This is what Smiley says to Carla in the flashback. And I think it's, you know, he's trying to basically convince him to turn, right? To come with them, to turn, to not go back to Moscow. The idea is they've captured him, and if he goes back to Moscow, if he goes back to Russia, he might be shot. He might be killed. He's trying to convince him to come to their side. And he says here, and, you know, so the context is George Smiley is saying this to try and convince Carla to come. But deep down, we sort of get the idea that Smiley believes this, that this is not just a ploy. So let's see what he says. Look, I said, we're getting to be old men, and we've spent our lives looking for the weaknesses in one another's systems. I can see through Eastern values just as you can see through our Western ones. Both of us, I am sure, have experienced ad nauseum the technical satisfactions of this wretched war. But now your own side is going to shoot you. Don't you think it's time to recognize that there is as little worth on your side as there is on mine? And that's, I think, one of the key thematic ideas. The key thematic idea is that deep down, Smiley does not believe there is anything worthwhile to fight for in England. This is what makes him ultimately different from Carla, because Carla, as we see, at least in this novel, I'm not talking yet about future novels, because Carla and Smiley's feud continues in future novels, but in this one, Carla is much more ideological. Carla does not share this idea with Smiley. Carla believes. And that's why in the end, in this scene, he wins. He doesn't say a word. He goes back to Russia. He ends up not getting shot, but in fact rising to power. And he ends up using the knowledge of Smiley that he learned in this scene, using the knowledge that Smiley is obsessed, anxiously obsessed with his wife and with the idea of one's spouse. And he uses that knowledge to undermine the circus, to undermine Smiley. But that key line that Smiley says, there is as little worth on your side as there is on mine. That's a profound articulation of what Smiley believes, and I believe what John le Carré feels as well. That the moral values that England might once have been fighting for, if they existed at all, are totally gone. Completely and totally gone. So now, jumping ahead to kind of the ending of the novel, towards the end at least, there are a lot of passages in the last few chapters when we finally do learn who the mole is that really dig this theme deep. It's like a knife really digging into you as you read this, reminding you of the futility of any goodness left in England during the Cold War. One of the first passages I want to look at, though, this is in chapter 36. This is actually right before we learn who the mole is. So the context here, Smiley has basically set everything up and is essentially waiting, right? Waiting for the mole to arrive and for him to see who it's going to be, waiting for the mole to meet his contact. And as he's sitting and watching, he's reflecting. He's reflecting on everything. It's a long passage, but I want to read the whole thing because I think there's a lot here that's really powerful and really important. So this is towards the middle of chapter 36, towards the middle. Alone in the darkness of the drawing room, Smiley also waited, sitting in the housekeeper's uncomfortable chair, his head propped awkwardly against the earpiece of the telephone. Occasionally he would mutter something, and Mendel would mutter back. Most of the time they shared the silence. His mood was subdued, even a little glum. Like an actor, he had a sense of approaching anticlimax before the curtain went up, a sense of great things dwindling to a small, mean end. As death itself seemed small and mean to him after the struggles of his life. He had no sense of conquest that he knew of. His thoughts, as often when he was afraid, concerned people. So let's pause there for a second, right? The key there is that he feels this sense of anticlimax, a sense of great things dwindling to a small, mean end. I mean, that might as well sum up England, right, in this era. Great empire dwindling to a small, mean end. So the line has this double meaning. It's not just about the revelation, the answer to the mystery, but even thematically what's happening to England more broadly. And of course, right, this is going to be kind of an anticlimax because, okay, we discover who the mole is, but it's not something triumphant, as we're going to see. It's not a triumphant victory for George Smiley. It's very dark, it's very sad, it's very cynical. It's a big letdown because it confirms what Smiley has been suspecting this whole time about England, about the country that he serves. That, what did he say earlier? That there is no worth in England. There is as little worth in my side as there is on yours. It confirms that sentiment that he articulates to Carla at the midpoint of the novel. So here, he's thinking about that. He's thinking about the idea of anticlimax. So continuing on, he had no theories or judgments in particular. He simply wondered how everyone would be affected, and he felt responsible. He thought of Jim and Sam and Max and Connie and Jerry Westerby. Those are all people he's spoken to, right, over the course of the last few chapters, the middle of the novel, the people he's spoken to, the people who have, to some extent, suffered, right, the various people he's spoken to. And personal loyalties all broken. In a separate category, he thought of Anne and the hopeless dislocation of their talk on the Cornish cliffs. He wondered whether there was any love between human beings that did not rest upon some sort of self-delusion. He wished he could just get up and walk out before it happened, but he couldn't. He worried, in a quite paternal way, about Gwillem, and wondered how he would take the late strains of growing up. He thought again of the day he buried control. He thought about treason, and wondered whether there was mindless treason in the same way, supposedly, as there was mindless violence. It worried him that he felt so bankrupt, that whatever intellectual or philosophical precepts he clung to broke down entirely now that he was faced with the human situation. So that is a magnificent passage. I think I would argue, maybe the most important passage in the novel, because it sums up thematically everything that we've been talking about, and it connects it to George's feelings, right? So what does it say is that he doesn't feel this sense of triumph. He's about to find out who the mole is. He's about to win, basically. He doesn't feel a sense of triumph. He wants to leave. He doesn't actually want to know who it is, because he seems to suspect, right, that this treason is just mindless, right? Just like mindless violence, there is just mindless treason. And he starts thinking about all the people he knows. He thinks about Control, who he buried, who's a kind of father figure to him, right? The last chief who died without having learned who the mole was. He thinks about Gwillem, who is his protege and kind of his surrogate son. And of course he thinks about his wife, the ever unfaithful Anne. Anne is the one character who he still has faith in, right? We're going to look at a line later that emphasizes this. But in this moment, even with Anne, he's sort of wondering whether there was any love between human beings that did not rest upon some sort of self-delusion. I mean, he's essentially seeing things for what they are. He's realizing that maybe his love for Anne, his wife, is a form of self-delusion. That's essentially going to be what we learn by the end. And that's what he realizes by the end, that there's no triumph in the ending, even though he wins. There's no triumphant reunion with his wife, triumphant victory. It is just bleak. And this passage kind of presages that bleakness by suggesting that what we're about to witness is going to be actually something very, very anticlimactic. So then now let's look at the key passages when both Smiley and Gwillem react to the knowledge that it's Bill Hayden, that he's the one who is the spy. So let's look first at Smiley's reaction. So this is still in chapter 36, the same chapter. So towards the end, Hayden had betrayed, as a lover, a colleague, a friend, as a patriot, as a member of that inestimable body that Anne loosely called the Set. In every capacity, Hayden had overtly pursued one aim and secretly achieved its opposite. Smiley knew very well that even now he did not grasp the scope of that appalling duplicity. Yet there was a part of him that rose already in Hayden's defense. Was not Bill also betrayed? Connie's lament rang in his ears. Poor loves, trained to empire, trained to rule the waves. You're the last, George, you and Bill. He saw with painful clarity an ambitious man, born to the big canvas, brought up to rule, divide and conquer, whose visions and vanities all were fixed, like Percy's, upon the world's game, for whom the reality was a poor island with scarcely a voice that would carry across the water. Thus, Smiley felt not only disgust, but, despite all that the moment meant to him, a surge of resentment against the institutions he was supposed to be protecting. The social contract cuts both ways, you know, said Lacon. The minister's lolling mendacity, Lacon's tight-lipped moral complacency, the bludgeoning greed of Percy Alaline. Such men invalidated any contract. Why should anyone be loyal to them? So this is a great passage because what is Smiley feeling here when he realizes it's Hayden? There's a perverse sympathy that Smiley actually feels for Hayden. He understands why Bill Hayden betrayed everyone. That's the profound kind of brilliance of this passage. What does it say? Was not Bill also betrayed? In other words, Smiley doesn't feel the sense of victory, doesn't feel the sense of anger. He actually feels bad for Bill. It says here, a part of him that rose in Bill's defense, a part of him that rose in Hayden's defense, right? He thinks about that line from Connie. And then he thinks about how, as he's kind of sympathizing with Bill and imagining what it must be like to be Bill, He feels a surge of resentment against the institutions he was supposed to be protecting. Right? Smiley himself feels what Bill felt. Resentment against the institutions of the British Empire. And then he lists 3 different characters who we've briefly met. The minister, who has lolling mendacity. Lacon, who is not a bad character, of course, but who has, as Smiley says here, a tight-lipped moral complacency. And then, of course, Alaline, right, the new chief, who has just simply bludgeoning greed. And as Smiley thinks about these 3 characters, he feels what Bill felt. Why should anyone be loyal to them? Right, the idea here is that the reason Bill became a traitor was because England was no longer worth being loyal to. That's the brutal truth that Smiley realizes at the end. It's such a perfect ending because, again, it's not a triumph. It's not a reordering of the moral universe, as we said. It's the exact opposite. Smiley realizes, even as he catches Bill, Smiley realizes that Bill was correct, that the mole was correct, that England actually is not worth being loyal to. That's a profoundly dark place for a spy to reach. And that is why John le Carré has no equal. Because no spy novel that I've ever read has achieved something like this at the end, has achieved this level of pure cynicism about empire, about nationhood, about all the things that we claim to hold valuable. And then, of course, we get Gwilym's reaction. Let's look at Gwilym's reaction. So Gwilym feels angry. This is what Gwilym says. At the drawing room door, he listened long enough for the fury to break in him at last. His butchered agents in Morocco, his exile to Brixton, the daily frustration of his efforts as daily he grew older and youth slipped through his fingers, the drabness that was closing round him, the truncation of his power to love, enjoy, and laugh, the constant erosion of the standards he wished to live by, the checks and stops he had imposed on himself in the name of tacit dedication. He could fling them all in Haydn's sneering face. So Gwilym lists basically all of the things he's felt in this novel. What I really like, the phrase that really sticks with you is the truncation of his power to love, enjoy, and laugh. You know, the subplot here that we see with Gwilym is he has this brief love affair with this woman, this kind of art student who plays the flute, right? And it's a continually strained love affair. He really can never connect with her purely in any earnest or meaningful way. It's not real love, and it never feels like real love. Certainly not like the love Ricky Tarr seemed to feel for Irina. None of that earnest pureness. Just something drab and cold and bleak. And Gwilym seems to link all that here with Haydn. He's able to take all that, all the frustrations, what does he say? The constant erosions of the standards he wished to live by. Essentially the erosion of the old standards of the British Empire, and he can fling it now in Haydn's face. A very different reaction than Smiley. Not cynicism or profound melancholy, but anger. Anger and resentment. If we keep reading, Haydn once his confessor, Haydn always good for a laugh, a chat, and a cup of burnt coffee. Haydn, a model on which he built his life. And more. Now that he saw, he knew. Haydn was more than his model. He was his inspiration, the torch-bearer of a certain kind of antiquated romanticism, a notion of English calling which, for the very reason that it was vague and understated and elusive, had made sense of Gwilym's life till now. In that moment, Gwilym felt not merely betrayed, but orphaned. His suspicions, his resentments for so long turned outward on the real world, on his women, his attempted loves, now swung upon the circus and the failed magic that had formed his faith. That's a wonderful line, a wonderful set of lines, right? First of all, he emphasizes that Haydn was not just his inspiration, but the model for a certain kind of antiquated romanticism, a notion of Englishness. Think about what Jim Prideaux said at the very beginning of the book, the very first passage we read. This idealized vision of what England is. Bill essentially was that version of England for Peter, for Gwillem. And now that's gone. Now that's been shattered. And how does Gwillem feel? He feels not just betrayed, but orphaned. Remember, Gwillem represents the new generation, the younger generation, right? The ones who are going to inherit this leadership. And he realizes that the father figures he looked up to, Hayden, and by extension, England, have died. Have died, or maybe died long ago. Or maybe were already dead. And he feels orphaned as a result. And that last line, the failed magic that had formed his faith. Again, think of religion and faith, right? The last context in which we've seen discussions of God, religion, and faith were Riccitar and Irina. Irina's emphasis on God and love and faith and leaving the secret world. What we see here is that for Peter, for Gwillem, the secret world was his faith. He put all of his faith in the circus. He doesn't believe in God. He's not a God-fearing man. He's not a Christian, it seems. The circus was his faith, and now he's lost his faith. When he sees that Bill was the one who was the traitor, he's lost his faith. And the brilliance of this novel, the brilliance of the way it ends, is that Gwillem's faith will not be restored in any way. You know, so many novels, they want to reorder the moral universe at the end. They almost can't abide this kind of pure cynicism. They want to bring everything back to the way it started. Or else even if they want to acknowledge this kind of pessimism, they still try and give you a little hint of optimism at the end. This idea that, oh, things are going to be okay. What's brilliant about John le Carré here with this novel is that he doesn't do that. Things are not going to be okay for any of these characters. They have lost their faith in the moral ordered universe that made up their lives. And that can never be undone. That's, again, why this novel as a spy novel is so unique and so different. It does something that very few spy novels I've seen have done. And that's what makes it this literary masterpiece. Let's look at the very end now, chapter 38. One last scene that I want to look at towards the end. So Smiley's last conversation with Bill, it sort of ends with them talking about Anne, Smiley's wife, who Bill was having an affair with. And we learn that Bill's affair was sort of ordered by Carla. It's kind of the final sting on Smiley. That this was how Bill was able to say hidden, right? What does he say? But you had this one price, Anne, the last illusion of the illusionless man. He reckoned that if I were known to be Anne's lover around the place, he wouldn't see me very straight when it came to other things. So we learn that, Smiley is a man who is illusionless. He's described as the illusionless man. He has no illusions. He's cynical. The one thing he has illusions about is his wife. And that's what Carla picked up on in the flashback, and that's what he uses to get at him. The one thing that Smiley still had faith in was his wife, was love. And now that's broken too, because he realizes that that was the way that Bill could get to him. And the final scene with Smiley, he goes to basically the place where he knows, at the beginning of the novel, we learn that his wife is having another affair with another young man, and that they're somewhere in a place called Immingham. And so Smiley decides finally to go there to sort of meet his wife, basically, to see his wife. He goes to the train station, and this is how the section ends. Then he saw her disreputable car shunting towards him down the lane marked buses only, and Anne at the wheel, staring the wrong way. Saw her get out, leave the indicator winking, and walk into the station to inquire. Tall and puckish, extraordinarily beautiful, essentially another man's woman. So it ends with this really heartbreaking passage where he finally sees Anne, and the passage is filled with these ideas of wrongness, right? These ideas of transgression. Her car is described as disreputable. She's driving down a lane marked buses only. She's staring the wrong way, and she leaves her indicator on as she gets out. A bunch of different things and actions she does to suggest that she is not doing things right, that she is transgressive. In this case, obviously, she's transgressing the bounds of their marriage. And it ends with him essentially realizing that, yeah, she's beautiful, but she is another man's woman. She is not his. That's the last scene with George Smiley in this novel. There's one more scene at the end with Jim, but with the last scene with Smiley is this realization that he has that Anne is not his, that she may be his wife, but she is another man's woman. I mean, and that's a shattering way to end this novel. Truly, truly cynical now. As it says, Anne for him was the last illusion, right? The last illusion of the illusionless man. And in the end, even that illusion is shattered. So Smiley ends this novel immensely, purely cynical. There are no more illusions for Smiley. And that's a very dark and sad and tragic ending. And that's what makes this novel so brilliant, is how unrelentingly bleak it is. What an unrelentingly bleak commentary on the state of England and the British Empire during the 70s, during this period of the Cold War. And, I find it interesting when I think about the movie adaptation from 2011. The movie adaptation is really good, but unfortunately it ends on this very triumphant note, right? The final scene is this great upbeat 70s song playing, and Smiley sits down in the chair at the head of the table and smiles. He is now leader of the circus, and it's such a triumphant note to end the film on, and it's totally wrong. It has nothing to do with, it's nothing like the ending of the novel. And that triumphalism in the film seems to suggest that, again, it's the way that I feel like people today just cannot be bleak enough, cannot be cynical enough. It's that we don't believe in cynicism anymore. We're so, we want our stories to reassure us. And so even the ending to that movie, it's an attempt to reassure us that, yes, the West might be ugly, as Colin Firth's character says, but Smiley is now head of the circus and maybe things will be okay. The truth is, even Le Carré's later novels, right? The third book in this series is called Smiley's People, in which he finally captures Carla. That book is fine. That book is entertaining, but it's nothing like this book. And part of the reason is Le Carré kind of pulls back on his own cynicism. That book, the third book in this series, ends with Smiley successfully capturing Carla. And it's far too optimistic, far too victorious. It lacks the profound bleakness of this book, and that's why I think this book is the masterpiece, and that book is just a fun sequel that you can read. The Honorable Schoolboy, I should say, the second book in this series, that also actually has a pretty profound bleakness. That one I feel like matches the tone of this one, a harsh and savage critique of empire. I think John le Carré is at his best when he is cynical, because he captures the rot at the heart of what we think of as Western values during the Cold War. And, ultimately, where does the Cold War go in the 80s? We have Reagan, we have Thatcher, we have these sort of false reassurances of victory over communism. But looking back, we can sort of see that Le Carré was right? That spirit, that pessimistic spirit of the 70s feels more real to us now than the fake optimism of the 80s, especially given the way the world has gone, since the Cold War ended, especially given the way the West has gone since the Cold War ended. England today, right? Well, we'll look at, we might look at more John le Carré novels later. He has some wonderful novels that are set after the Cold War, where he continues his trademark cynicism about the moral values that we claim to stand by. But this novel, I think is perfectly representative of his moral vision, as well as in its style. It's very representative of how he sees the world. Smiley is, as people have said, the anti-James Bond. He is described in this novel as fat. His clothes don't always fit. He has these glasses that are not very appealing. I mean, it's constantly emphasized that he's not very attractive and that this is why Anne keeps sleeping around, right? That she's not genuinely attracted to him. And yet, according to Le Carré, let's think about what Smiley represents as a character. Even though it ends with him experiencing this profound cynicism, he succeeds in unearthing the spy. And why does he succeed? Earlier, it was emphasized that Smiley and Bill Hayden were the last of their generation, the last of this type of old-fashioned adventurous spy. Bill Hayden was the adventurous one, though. He was the exotic one. He was the dramatic one, during the war, doing all kinds of things. Smiley is the opposite. Smiley is an intellectual. Smiley likes his old books. Smiley likes reading. Smiley walks slow. He thinks. He cleans his glasses with his tie. He is a kind of character who doesn't seem very heroic. He's not romantic. He's the exact opposite. And yet, Le Carré is suggesting that it's this type of diligence, this organized mind, this careful approach to espionage that ultimately wins the day. That it's not the flashiness. And so I suppose if you want to, you could read Smiley as a hero, though I think that misses the point of the book. I think a better way to think of it is to read him as a symbol of a type in England at this moment. And for Le Carré, the last type that is basically standing between England and total decline. Because if it wasn't Smiley, then it would be the ambitious strivers who we talked about earlier, the people like Percy Alleline, who represent that empty, ambitious striving. All right, so we'll sort of wrap up there. I think there's a lot more we could say about this novel. It's such a rich text. We've already gone very long. I would just recommend, read it, enjoy it. Don't rely simply on the movie or the TV show to guide your ideas or interpretations. Read the novel, because the experience of the novel is so different, as we've said, so much more profoundly cynical. And of course, the style and the pace and the tone are all essential in conveying that bleakness that Le Carré is going for. And as always, thank you guys for being here. If you liked what you heard, remember to like, subscribe, and share the podcast. And I'll see you all next time.